In this video, you'll learn about the basic concepts of iMIDIPatchbay. iMIDIPatchbay is an app that allows you to control your MIDI devices in your musical setup, and it is designed especially for keyboard players. One main feature is that you can send program changes to your keyboards and sound expanders. Another main feature lets you easily create split zones on your keyboards and assign your sounds to them. This can be very useful for you, especially if your keyboard doesn't have any built-in capabilities for splitting and layering sounds. And even if it does, there's a big chance that iMIDIPatchbay makes some related tasks a lot easier. Before we go into the details of the app, let me give you a short demonstration of what this is all about. My example setup consists of a Nord piano of the first generation and a Yamaha Motif Rack-ES, which is a multi-timbral sound expander. Both are connected via MIDI DIN to an iConnect MIDI interface, which in turn is connected to my iPad. With this interface, my iPad can receive the MIDI data from the devices and send data back to them. You can use any other interface that is CoreMIDI compatible and that has enough MIDI ports to connect all your devices. The Nord, the Yamaha and the iPad are furthermore connected to an audio interface for recording this tutorial. As a first example, I've used iMIDIPatchbay to create a split on the keyboard. On the upper part, I have the internal sound of the Nord piano, which is an E-piano sound. And on the lower part, I have a bass sound from the Yamaha. At this point, it is important to note that the Nord piano itself doesn't have a feature which could send MIDI to the Yamaha when I only play on this part of the keyboard. And even more importantly, it cannot mute its internal sound on a key range either. The Yamaha in turn has some MIDI functionality which I could have used to make the bass sound play only for notes lower than a certain note. But doing that on this small display is really a bit fiddly, and again, the Nord would still play its sounds on the lower part of the keyboard. However, with iMIDIPatchbay I can overcome these limitations of my sound devices, and I'm going to show you how. But first I want to show you another example configuration. I'll actually switch to another song in iMIDIPatchbay and you'll see that each of my sound devices switch to a different program as a result. In this configuration I don't have a split as before, but a layering. In other words, I play two sounds at the same time across the whole keyboard. The piano sound comes from the Nord and the string sound comes from the Yamaha. Well, I could also have achieved that by simply connecting the MIDI out of the Nord to the MIDI in of the Yamaha, and by that send all notes of the Nord to the Yamaha. But what I wanted in this configuration, besides the simple layering, is that the sustain pedal only affects the piano sound, but not the strings. So in this case, iMIDIPatchbay is filtering out the MIDI data from the sustain pedal before sending MIDI to the Yamaha. For comparison, let me switch on the sustain pedal now, and I do that by just holding one button here and shortly pressing the sustain pedal, and from now on the pedal will control the Yamaha too. Well, these were two little examples. I could have combined more sounds and used more than one split point, but I think you already got the idea of what you can do with iMIDIPatchbay. So now let me show you in detail how you actually work with the app. When you start iMIDIPatchbay for the first time, it looks like this. At the top, there's a display showing the selected song, and these buttons here allow me to save the song, make a copy, or step through my songs. However, the most important part of the app is the lower part. These columns here are called sections, and each of them can be used to send MIDI data to a MIDI device. Actually, there are two different types of sections. Those on the right side are extern sections, and they are used to control sound devices that only receive MIDI, like my Yamaha Motif Rack-ES, which doesn't have any keys or drum pads, which I could play and which would produce MIDI. It only has a sound engine, which can be controlled via MIDI. So an extern section is used to send MIDI data to a sound device. On the left side, there are master sections. In iMIDIPatchbay, a master represents a MIDI device that generates MIDI, and that you want to use as a controller for other devices. So in my case, my Nord piano acts as a master. When I play on it, it will generate MIDI according to the keys that I press, and I'm going to use that to play sounds on my Yamaha, for example. However, I don't want the Nord piano to act only as a master keyboard. I also want to use its internal sounds. In other words, it is not only a master, but also a sound device. Since there are these two different aspects of a keyboard, a master section in iMIDIPatchbay is divided into two parts accordingly. This upper part here corresponds to the keyboard as a MIDI source, and the lower part is used to send data back to the keyboard in order to trigger its own sounds. If I were using a keyboard without internal sounds, then I would just ignore the lower part of the master section, since there would be no point in sending MIDI back to the keyboard. The first thing that you have to do when getting started with iMIDIPatchbay is going to Setup. This screen allows you to make some global settings, and what needs to be done here is to specify which MIDI device and channel your master keyboard is sending on. So I click on Device and select the MIDI port that I'm using for the Nord. When I play on the keyboard now, the red light here starts to flash. This is a useful indicator that the master has been configured correctly. The next thing that needs to be done is set local control to off in the Nord. This means that the keyboard will only send MIDI notes when I play, but won't trigger its own sounds itself. The reason that I set it to off is that I want to use iMIDIPatchbay to control which sounds are played when I am pressing certain keys. If I kept local control on, iMIDIPatchbay could not mute parts of the keyboard. As you have seen in the demonstration at the beginning, I can save different configurations in iMIDIPatchbay and recall them later. However, the selection of device and channel for the master keyboard is a global one, and it is the same for all songs in iMIDIPatchbay. This is true for all settings made in the setup, by the way, so everything that you do here will affect all songs. In the basic version of iMIDIPatchbay, there is one master section available. However, with an in-app purchase, you can get 3 more. Since multiple masters will give you a lot more possibilities, this will be covered in a separate video. Now that the master keyboard is configured properly, we can start building a MIDI configuration. In the first example, I had a split configuration. I was playing 2 different sounds on 2 different parts of the keyboard. In order to achieve that, I first have to specify that my master keyboard should have 2 zones. And I do that in the upper part of the master section, which has the caption Zones of Master 1. The default value is 1 zone, which corresponds to the whole keyboard. I changed that to 2 zones by pressing the button which says 2 zones. By pressing it again, I could switch back to 1 zone. When 2 zones are activated, this little display shows the split point, which specifies where the lower zone ends and the upper zone starts. I can change that split point by pressing and holding this button and playing a note on the keyboard. If you suddenly realize that you didn't want to change the split point, you can swipe away from the button without releasing your finger until the button goes up and the split point goes back to the original note. When I play the keyboard now, there is no sound played because I haven't used any section yet to trigger any of my devices. So first I'm going to enable the internal sound of the Nord just by pressing the on button of the master section. The lights at the very bottom of the section indicate that it's activated on all keyboard zones. Although I've already set that there should be 2 zones, this section is currently configured by default to be active on both zones. Now, by holding the on button and playing any note within the upper keyboard zone, I changed the assigned zones to that zone only. By playing a note within the lower zone, I add the lower zone to the selection. By pressing the same note another time, I remove it again. In case you want to select the keyboard zones exclusively via the iPad, you can hold the on button and wait. iMIDIPatchbay will start cycling through all available zone combinations, and you can lift the finger once you've arrived at the desired position. You can abort this by swiping the finger away from the button, or by starting to select a zone via the keyboard. For the bass sound on the lower part of the keyboard, I'll use extern section 1. First, I'll select the lower keyboard zone, and then I'll go to the MIDI settings of this section. Here I can select device and channel for the MIDI device that I want to control with that section. When I play now on the lower key zone, the Yamaha plays the bass sound. Now, the MIDI routing needed for the split configuration is complete. However, I was lucky that the right sounds have already been selected on the Nord and the Yamaha. Normally, this is not the case, of course, and for that reason, I now make iMIDIPatchbay send the appropriate program change commands to the devices. For that, I'll go back to the MIDI settings of Extern Section 1 and activate program changes. Then I'll select the program number and finally MSB and LSB. The values for the latter two should be documented in the manual of the device that you want to use. Now I'm done with Extern Section 1, I have to do the same with the Master section. I'll switch to its settings and adjust the values. And that's it. Now I save the configuration. However, it's useful to give the configuration a proper name, so I click on the name and type something, and save again. In order to create the next configuration with the layering, I'll copy this configuration. Then I set the number of key zones to 1, and you see that the lights at the bottom of each section indicate that they are now active across the whole keyboard. When I play now, you can hear that we already have a layering. But the sounds are still the ones from the previous song. So I'll update the program changes. First, I go again to the MIDI settings of the Master section and set the program number and the one of the Extern Section 1. When changing the program values here, program change commands will immediately be sent to the device, so the sounds have already been selected by now. As a next step, I want to disable the sustain pedal for the Yamaha. This is actually very easy because iMIDIPatchbay offers a shortcut for that for often used controllers. These are sustain, pitch bend, expression, modulation and aftertouch. By default, they are all activated, as you can see by the red lights. In order to change a controller setting, I hold the on button of the section and activate the corresponding controller. So in my case, I push down the sustain pedal. You see that the light goes off, and from now on, the sustain pedal is off for this section. I could re-enable it the same way. All other controllers that the master might send can be enabled or disabled in the MIDI settings of a section. At the bottom, there is an option called Forward Control Changes from the master. For an extern section, it is disabled by default because in most cases you don't want the knobs on the keyboard to change something in your other devices by mistake. However, master sections will always send all controllers back to the master keyboard. This is to ensure that the knobs on the keyboard continue to control the internal sound. Remember that I have set local control to off in the Nord, and the knobs will only send MIDI but won't change any parameters in the keyboard directly. Their MIDI messages have to be routed back to the keyboard by iMIDIPatchbay in order to control the internal sound. That's why changing this setting for a master section would have no effect here. When you're using multiple master sections, this is a bit different, but this whole topic will be covered in another video. As a last thing, I'd like to adjust the volume of the string sound. It is a bit too loud compared to the piano sound. Fortunately, iMIDIPatchbay allows you to control some common MIDI parameters like volume, pan, reverb, chorus, and so on. You can select them with a little button and then adjust the value with a knob. With 2 fingers, you can increase the sensitivity, and the plus and minus buttons can also help you to select a certain value. When you change the value, the corresponding control change command will be sent to the sound device. Keep in mind that this modifies the selected preset on the device. In order to keep that new value for volume, I would either have to save the preset on the device with that new value, or tell iMIDIPatchbay to send that control change command every time the song is loaded. This can be useful, for example, if you have selected a factory preset on the device, which you cannot overwrite. All you have to do is hold this button for a short time until this little light with the caption "Send on Load" goes on. When I now switch to another song and then come back to this one, the volume value will be sent just after the program change command. So the device gets not only set to the right program, but also to the right volume. You can do the same with the other parameters as well. That's all for now, thanks for watching.